class is called Compensation and Buyer Agreement Forms. It is a rip-roaring time of going line by line on the things that you and your customers will sign. So let's dive in. Before I go any further, I just want to remind you that when you are in the presence of a real estate competitor, please refrain from asking any of the following questions. What should we charge? What's the going rate? What does everyone else charge? What time lengths should I fill in my buyer's agreement? And how much retainer should I charge? So let's refrain from those specific business practice questions because honestly, it is an antitrust violation. So here are a list of all the Florida Realtor forms that have to do with compensation agreements and buyer agreements. So the list is here. It looks overwhelming when you look at it, but we're going to go through one by one and tell you what you're going to use each one for. Here are a list of the NABOR forms that we have as of today, which is July 30th. So we'll take a look at those as well. Your biggest resource is your legal team. And once again, I am so not a lawyer. I am just a broker, and I'm not your lawyer. I'm not your buyer's lawyer or your seller's lawyer. We always recommend that all contracts are reviewed by an attorney, and there are two resources that we recommend. In terms of the Florida Realtor forms, your best bet is to call the Florida Realtor hotline, the legal hotline. That is a free service to all Florida Realtor members. So the hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:45. You can submit a question online and they will call you back. I've never had to wait more than half a day for an answer, or on the phone. I'm sure they have high call volume. Just try to call. If not, submit the form online. You can go to floridarealtors.org and get that number if you don't have time to jot it down. Just have your license number handy. Or our preferred title company is Title Plus Closing and Escrow. That's our joint venture with GDC Law, which is the largest, law firm in Naples. So our main point of contact there is Brandon, and he's the attorney that oversees all the closings. His phone number is there, 239-202-0343. So that could be particularly helpful to you if you are wanting to write contract language. We also have this buyer agreement workflow. Again, I'm updating this. I'm almost done, but this takes what we're doing verbally and puts it into a visual workflow document so that you know what to use when. So here are the big changes. Number one, offers of compensation will be removed from the MLS this Wednesday night. Number two, buyer concessions can be added to the remarks on some MLS platforms. Check with your MLS on what is or what isn't allowed. Number three, any buyer working with the realtor will have to sign a written agreement prior to touring the property after August 17th of this year. That does include pending contracts. A buyer agent cannot receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount in the written agreement with the buyer. Premiere Plus Realty or any brokerage cannot pay you $1 more than what is in your written agreement with your buyer. So just as a notice, as a disclosure from Premiere, there is no requirement that our agents must make offers or accept offers of compensation from buyer brokers or other buyer representatives, or that if made, such offers have to be blanket, unconditional, or unilateral. Okay? You have freedom here to fully negotiate your compensation. So what are your next steps? So the offers of compensation will be removed from MLS this Wednesday night, tomorrow night. Number one, check your current listings and remove any compensation language from private remarks, supplemental materials, and showing time. Check with your MLS on what language is allowed and what language is prohibited. For example, the seller concession language. Number three, understand your compensation verification form options. That's what today's class is about. because we no longer have the MLS to verify our comp. We've got to use these forms. Number 4, send your current sellers a disclosure, and don't worry, we will provide this to you by the end of the week. So with the rule that any buyer working with the realtor will have to sign a written agreement prior to touring a property beginning August 17th, what do you need to do before then? You need to understand what working with a buyer means. You need to get to know your written agreement options, which is what we're doing today. You need to execute a written agreement with your buyer if you are currently under contract and closing after August 17th. Again, after August 17th, we are not legally allowed to pay you unless there's a written agreement and it is at or below what is agreed to what's in the closing statement. Number 4, compensation must be objectively ascertainable, exact amounts, no ranges or putting whatever the seller is offering. Here are your next steps for the rule that includes buyer agent cannot receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount in the written agreement with the buyer. So you really need to understand the modifications to compensation agreements, which we'll go over in today's class, because you can modify those agreements as you go along the transaction. And what happens to the overage amount? We will discuss what all the options are in 2 classes: conversations about compensation and the buyer representation best practices classes. We go through all of those scenarios in depth and pros and cons. So remember, compensation must be objectively ascertainable exact amounts, no ranges or whatever the seller is offering. So breaking news here, I've been saying this the last couple of days, but Premiere Plus Realty agents are now authorized to sign certain compensation and buyer agreements on behalf of the managing broker. Associates are not authorized to sign listing agreements. There's a caveat to that. The broker will void and return or require modifications to any contract that is not completed properly. Buyer agent cannot receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount in the written agreement with the buyer. I think that's the 3rd time I've said that in the last 2 minutes. So I hope that's super clear to you. Okay, so here's the immediate need. Thursday morning, you're going to wake up and you're going to look for properties for your buyer, and you won't know what the offer of compensation is on the MLS. So how are you going to find that out? So as a buyer's agent, you'll no longer have the MLS as a verification of buyer's agent compensation. Now you ought to verify, it's not required, but it would be a great practice to protect your commission. You ought to verify via a signed form. You're basically trading one form for another. In that the MLS wasn't a form, but typically you would save that screen with a time and date stamp before you tour the property to prove what the offer of comp was. Now it's a form that we fill out to memorialize that offer of comp. So it can be a form between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker, or between the seller and the buyer's broker. So here are your form options: the Florida Realtors Compensation Agreement seller to buyer's broker, the modification to that, the NABOR showing compensation agreement, no brokerage, that's between the seller and the broker. The Florida Realtors Compensation Agreement, seller's broker to buyer's broker, that's between listing agent and selling agent. Or the NABOR broker compensation agreement, that's broker to broker. Okay, so Florida Realtors and NABOR both have an option for seller to broker and broker to broker. All right, let's get into it. So this is what you need to know immediately. How are you going to verify that compensation from the seller? One option is this Florida Realtor seller to buyer's broker. So you can use this for a seller who wishes to pay compensation to a buyer's broker who procures a buyer who purchases the seller's property, okay? In order to earn compensation, the buyer's broker must be the procuring cause of the sale, and the sales contract must close. Best practice tip is to submit this form along with your offer to ensure the seller's offer of compensation to buyer's broker. So you don't have to, but it's my best recommendation to submit this along with your purchase offer, just to solidify that we all agree where that offer of comp is going and how much. So here's what it looks like. The seller to buyer's broker, it's a compensation agreement. The buyer's broker, this will be a trend here with all of these forms. You want to put your first name, your last name, the name on your license, please. If you've got some nickname you're walking around with, that's not going to hold up in a court of law or in NAR arbitration. Can you just put the name on your license, your full name? I don't care how long it is. Put your full name that's on your license and Premiere Plus Realty, okay? The seller needs to be the owner's name on the current deed, right? It could be a trust or an LLC or multiple names. The property address, pretty straightforward, but for good measure, add the PID. And then the seller's broker, put their first name, their last name, and their brokerage name. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have added the seller's broker. This is just to the seller. So forget that last little point. I didn't edit that. All right, so let's look at the term of the compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker. So this term takes effect when a fully executed copy has been delivered to all parties. The seller may pre-sign. So if you are, if you're listing a property, you may want to get the seller to pre-sign this and just send this out as your verification of compensation. You could also do this with the next form that we're going to look at. Here's what the buyer's broker compensation looks like. So this is what the seller will pay the buyer broker. You can do a flat fee, a percentage of the gross purchase price, or a combination of all of that. It must be an exact amount. It cannot be a range. I would also include the $245 customer processing fee in other terms, or for example, in the percentage of the gross purchase price of the property plus dollar amount, put your $245 customer processing fee. So that's what the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer broker. Let's see. One thing to note is that there are default day periods, just like with any contract. This one is 30 days, and it extends to the life of the purchase contract if you do get under contract. So let's take a look here. Let's see. I don't think there was another point I wanted to make on that. All right, so dispute resolution. Remember, this is between an individual seller and a buyer broker. So it doesn't include the NAR board's arbitration process. This is just straight mediation arbitration with a consumer. So we wouldn't go through the board to dispute this one if necessary. Also, the form has the required disclosure. You'll see on almost all forms that commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Here's the modification to that compensation agreement. Again, you are able to modify. The caveat to that is that the seller and the buyer should both agree. The seller and the buyer really do need to be aware and agree to all money that is changing hands. They need to know exactly where it's going and agree before any changes are made. Let's see here. So what is the NABOR version of that, the seller to buyer broker? Well, it's the showing compensation agreement, no brokerage or agency relationship. This form may be used when a seller who wishes to pay compensation to a buyer's broker who procures a buyer who purchases the seller's property. In order to earn compensation, the buyer's broker must be the procuring cause of the sale, and the sales contract must close. So best practice, again, definitely execute this form prior to touring the property with your buyer to ensure the seller's offer of compensation to buyer's broker. This is best used in a FSBO situation, right? This is what it looks like. So again, the seller is the owner's name that's on the current deed, and the broker, I would love if you could put the name on your license and Premiere Plus Realty and the property address. This one is definitely property specific. So we want to be as specific as possible. So you could enter the seller shall allow broker to show and or market the property for a purchase price of blank. So you could enter the current purchase price. Some sellers might want you to enter a higher purchase price and say, well, I'm not gonna give you a compensation unless you get me this purchase price. So just, best practice would be just to put in the current purchase price. The broker owes the seller minimum duties, just our statutory duties for our license. It is a no brokerage relationship. And the compensation for a buyer. So this is not specific to a particular buyer, which you will get a written agreement with that buyer should one arise. And you need to enter your term length. Note that NABOR does calendar days there. And then compensation can be a combination of flat fee and percentage, but must not be a range. Okay. Again, you're going to want to add that $245 customer processing fee in these documents as well. So this is just a very big disclosure here between the seller and the buyer broker. It outlines what the seller is obligated to do and what the buyer broker is obligated to do. So the compensation, just so you know, if you're in a situation where there's a listing agreement, usually with this one, there's not. It needs to match what's in the listing agreement. The compensation may offer maybe a flat fee, percentage, or combo. So this is interesting. I wanted to point out to you. So the NABOR showing compensation agreement, no brokerage or agency. The default language is something you should be aware of and point out to the seller that if the seller defaults under a contract with a buyer procured by the broker and the transaction does not close as a result of seller's default, then the seller shall pay compensation to broker. So it's sort of a security for you to get that compensation. Seller, if they default on that, then the seller hereby grants to broker the right to place a lien on the property. Don't personally love that language, but that's what it says. And that is our right, I suppose. So here's to note, if any deposits paid by a buyer procured by a broker are retained by seller following a termination of the contract, blank or 50%, but not exceeding the full amount of unpaid comp will be paid to the broker. So you could put, 10%, 75%, 80%, whatever it is, if you would like to, but the default is 50. Let's see here. So that takes care of the relationship between just the seller and the buyer broker. Now let's talk about the relationship between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker in terms of verifying that compensation. So the Florida Realtor version is called compensation agreement, seller's broker to buyer's broker. And this form may be used where a seller's listing broker agrees to pay a buyer's broker who procures a buyer who purchases the listed property. In order to earn compensation, the buyer's broker must be the procuring cause of the sale, and the sales contract must close. Here's my best practice tip for you. Request this from the seller's broker and disclose to the buyer prior to considering an offer. Sign and submit this form along with your offer to ensure that the seller's broker and the seller's offer of comp is exactly what it says to the buyer's broker. Another best practice that I should have added here is if you're a listing agent, go ahead and pre-sign this seller's broker to buyer's broker and send this out as your verification of compensation. Anytime someone asks, send them a link to this document or do an email autoresponder to attach this document. All right, so what are the things to note about this form, the seller's broker to buyer's broker? We want the seller's broker first name, last name, brokerage name. We want your first name, last name that's on your license and Premiere Plus Realty. We want the property address. We want the buyer's name, but it is optional. So you could just receive one of these and execute it without a particular buyer. And I'll show you why you might want to do that just in case. But it does, if you do have a particular buyer for a particular property, go ahead and put the buyer's name that they will take title in. It just makes it cleaner in the long run. So the thing to note about this is this takes effect. So you can pre-sign this. This takes effect when a fully executed copy has been delivered to all parties. So seller's broker may pre-sign. You could pre-sign and date that and send it to the buyer broker all day long. It won't go into effect until they sign it, okay? And also extends when the property goes under contract with that party. Buyer broker compensation. So the amount in this agreement must match the amount in the listing agreement. Otherwise, you are doing something really unethical and it's fraud. So the seller's broker to buyer's broker must match what the seller is offering in the listing agreement. If the seller is not offering compensation to a buyer broker, then you wouldn't even sign this because the seller's not offering it. So this is only if the seller's offering comp, can only be the exact amount that's on the listing agreement. You can't kick in 0.5%. You can't do anything until you modify that listing agreement first. So the compensation, again, same across the board, could be a flat fee, could be a percentage of the gross sales price, could be a combo. Again, you wouldn't add the customer processing fee here because typically the listing broker doesn't pay that. One thing to note here, as in this contract, as opposed to the seller to buyer broker, is that the arbitration and mediation process goes through the local realtor board. So if you've got a problem with something that happens in your transaction and you want to dispute the amount with the listing broker, or you think they're being unfair, or that they signed something that was different than the listing agreement, then you would submit for mediation and arbitration at the board, and it's like a hearing, and there's money involved, and you could pay a lot. And we don't particularly love that process, so it would be great if we could just avoid that altogether. But any changes to any of this must be in writing, signed by all, and agreed to and disclosed to the seller and the buyer. So we can't have extra kick in 0.5%, 1%, an amount, a bonus here and there between brokers. We can't do that anymore without the seller and the buyer being aware and agreeing. And any modifications have to be in writing and signed by all parties. So there's a modification to that agreement. So again, if something happens through the life of the deal, you can, and everybody agrees, then you can get the modification signed. All right, so what does the NABOR version of that look like? It's a brand new form that they came out with called the Buyer Brokerage Agreement. So this is between brokers, listing brokers and selling brokers or buyers brokers. So again, this form may be used where a seller's listing broker agrees to pay a buyer's broker who procures a buyer who purchases the listed property. In order to earn compensation, the buyer's broker must be the procuring cause of the sale, and the sales contract must close. Again, same thing, request this from the listing broker and disclose to buyer prior to considering an offer. Sign and submit this form along with your offer to ensure the seller's broker, seller's offer of comp to buyer's broker. And again, if you're a listing agent, just pre-sign these suckers and hand them out like candy, because you're going to get 1,000 phone calls asking what the offer of comp is. Just have it ready to send, This is the easiest way to verify that compensation, starting Thursday. So listing broker, first name, last name, brokerage name, buyer's broker, your first name, your last name, as it is on your license, Premiere Plus Realty property address. And the thing that's different about the NABOR version versus the Florida Realtors version is that it is asking for a specific buyer. It agrees as follows with respect to the following buyer. So it's not a blanket statement that you could just get this blanket agreement like you can with the Florida Realtor one. The Florida Realtor one's a little more flexible in that regard. You could have 5 buyers and one of them gets it. You would need to get this signed with the listing broker with any buyer that is interested in making an offer on this property. So a little more laborious in my opinion. All right, so let's take a look at the compensation area of the broker-to-broker compensation agreement. So it discloses that the seller has agreed to let compensation for buyer's broker flow from the listing broker. So you'll see, I'll show you the listing agreement from NABOR later on. It allows, with the seller's permission, it allows the listing broker to share with the buyer broker. And the compensation, again, should match the listing agreement, must be exact numbers, no ranges. And this is very buyer specific. And the buyer broker must be the procuring cause with that buyer. So these are just extra terms in that you must modify in writing and provide to seller and buyer. So this one requires you to deliver to seller and buyer. And it also has the required disclosure of the compensation is fully negotiable and not set by law. Okay, those are your verification of compensation forms. You have Florida Realtor forms, you have NABOR forms, you have a version that goes from seller to buyer's broker, and you have a version that goes from listing broker to buyer's broker. So you, depending on your situation, you should get one of those forms signed as your verification that that's what the offer is. So best practice for listing agents, pre-fill those forms out, or if you're, it's just a seller, I guess if you're selling a FSBO, but for listing agents, either way, for the seller broker to buyer broker, pre-fill this out with your signature and compensation amounts. Set up an easy way to share this document with inquiring buyers and or buyer agents. And the best practice for buyer's agents, again, request this form prior to touring the property if feasible. Listen, you're not going to be able to get it all the time before touring the property, but at least before you make an offer so that you can let the buyer know what they're getting into and where the offer of compensation lies. Definitely execute this doc when you make an offer. Okay, so that satisfies the verification of compensation. How do I know that I know that I know that I know what the seller or the listing broker are offering the buyer agent compensation? That's how you do it right there, those forms. So now let's move into the written agreements with the buyer section. So starting August 17th, we need to enter into written agreements with buyers we are working with prior to touring a property. What does working with mean? Well, it means that you're identifying potential properties, you're arranging for the buyer to tour a home, you are negotiating on behalf of the buyer, you are presenting offers. What it does not mean is that you are simply marketing services to a buyer. If a buyer signed up on your website and you're just sending them properties, or they called you because you're a friend and a referral and you're just sending them properties, you've got them on a, an email list where you're sending them a hot sheet every day, you don't need a written agreement yet. Just talking to a buyer. So for example, if you are hosting an open house for Premiere Plus Realty, any Premiere Plus Realty open house, because the broker owns the listings, and an unrepresented buyer walks in, no written agreement needed. Or if you are a listing agent showing an unrepresented buyer the property on behalf of the seller, you don't need a written agreement with that unrepresented buyer. If the agent is only working on behalf of the seller, then the agent is not working for the buyer and the written agreement is not needed. So don't worry, your open houses and your showings of unwrapped buyers for your listings or any Premiere Plus listing is covered. And remember, we have like the most listings in Southwest Florida. So if your buyer that you just met wants to see a Premiere Plus Realty listing, it's not going to guarantee any compensation for you whatsoever, but if you're just really shy about getting a written agreement signed, you can show any Premiere Plus Realty listing to an unrepresented buyer and not get a written agreement, because the broker, we all are working on behalf of that seller as a transaction broker. But as a best practice, because you might walk into a Premiere listing and then look down the street and there's another listing that has a show and go and show, setting on their showing time. So it's best practice to get that written agreement signed, but just so you know what the letter of the rule is, the letter of the law. I hope that makes sense when we're talking about what does working with mean. So that's nice. You can work with the buyer all day long. You can talk to them for hours and hours on the phone. You could meet with them in the office. You could look at properties. You can deep dive and waste all kinds of time with no written agreement. That is your prerogative. But when do you actually need a written agreement? It is prior to your body crossing over the threshold of a property, or the buyer's body crossing over the threshold of the property. So you are touring a property on behalf of the buyer when you enter a property for sale with the buyer, when you guys cross the threshold. When you enter a property for sale with the buyer's friend or relative or advisor. I had a great question yesterday that said, I usually am working with a buyer that's out of town, but then maybe their kids are visiting in town and they want me to show them properties for their parent. Well, guess what? Your relationship using your license is with that parent, and you need a written agreement before you cross the threshold, or that advisor crosses the threshold, because that's just what the rule is. You're also touring a property on behalf of the buyer when you enter a property for sale and provide a virtual tour, meaning you walk in with your phone and you start taking videos to show your buyer because they're interested in it. And you've made a showing appointment and you're taking videos. Maybe you're doing some TikTok reels, I don't know, but you're doing a virtual live tour, or you're taking videos for your buyer to show them. You're technically touring the property on behalf of your buyer. A written agreement is required. Okay, so you are not touring a property on behalf of the buyer when you show an unrepresented buyer a Premiere Plus Realty listing, or when you show an unrepresented buyer or a guest around an open house. So that whole open house question, we can just relax on that. It's all good. Open houses as usual. All right, so with this written agreement, what are my options? Well, like any good legal answer, it depends. So the best written agreement between buyer's agent and the buyer you are working with prior to touring a property depends on your relationship with the buyer and what you and the buyer are comfortable signing. That's the key thing. The buyers might not want to sign something, and you might not have the salesman chops yet to convince them that this is required and in their best interest. So let's start with the least commitment to the greatest. So if you think about this like a dating relationship, or like a relationship with another person, it's very similar to the idea behind these professional relationships. So the Florida Realtor Property Pre-Touring Agreement, that's a brand new form. It is low commitment for both. It's basically like getting matched on one of those apps and going out to lunch, and then you might never hear from them again. So that's what the property pre-touring agreement, it satisfies the written agreement requirement, but it's low commitment on both. High risk for buyer's agent. That buyer can go around you. You might be able to negotiate a referral for procuring cause, but there is no protection in order. Because if that buyer enters a written agreement with another buyer that showed him the property, I don't know who's gonna win at arbitration on that one. So just so you know, it's high risk for you as a buyer broker, low risk for buyer, low commitment, low risk for buyer. So depending on that relationship, that might be where they are with you. I could see best case scenario for those quick online leads that call you, or someone who calls and wants to see a property today and they found you on Google. So the next relationship written agreement is the Florida Realtor Showing Agreement. Now, don't get this confused with the NABOR showing agreement. The NABOR showing agreement is between the seller and the broker. This is a showing agreement between the buyer and the broker. It is a medium commitment. It's kind of like you started dating. We've got some commitments to one another, some basic boundary understandings. There's a little bit of risk involved, and there is, some consequences if the relationship ends. So it's medium commitment, medium risk to the buyer agent, medium risk for the buyer. Perfect for those open house scenarios where the buyer turns to you and says, you know what, I kind of like this house. Would you be my agent and work the other side for me? Or the buyer says to you, thanks for hosting this open house, but I am actually interested in seeing the other houses for sale. Do you think you could show me those? Then you need a written agreement. Showing agreement is your best bet, but you could get a property pre-touring agreement as well. Now, the big Cadillac of commitment, the marriage commitment between you and the buyer, is the Florida Realtor exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, transaction broker, or the NABOR buyer broker agreement exclusive. Same idea. So high commitment, high commitment on both sides. Low risk for the buyer agent. You are protected. Your commission, your agreement is protected, but it is high risk for the buyer. The buyer might get a little scared if they see all of that language in there. And I think if you are able to go over the form with them line by line and ask if they would accept it and if they have any questions, you shouldn't have a problem getting these signed. But just for all intents and purposes, this is what those forms are. And remember, I'm not a lawyer, and this isn't legal advice. Okay. So let's talk about the property pre-touring agreement. What is that? So there's a description here. I won't read it all, but it is the lowest commitment necessary to satisfy that written agreement rule. We all have to get into written agreements with our buyers before touring a property. So what's the minimum barrier to entry with that? It is this agreement, the property pre-touring agreement. This is what it looks like. And you need to add the $245 customer fee in there to PPR at the very least. But you need to say what your name is, that it's the name on your license. It says, I am a real estate licensee with Premiere Plus Realty Brokerage. I think I'd like for you to put your name there just so that we know who's who. And then you'd put the consumer name. Best practice to ask them what name they want on title, but if you're in a hurry, then just get their legal name. And then again, you can have a stack of these pre-signed or ready for sending out with e-signature because it doesn't kick into effect until the date the last party signs this agreement. So the broker compensation, you do not owe broker compensation at this time, so no retainer agreement. And then it says, if you wish, buyer, if you wish in your heart, if you wish upon a star that maybe you want to work with this buyer to purchase the property the broker shows you. So they could not wish to do that, and they would be fully legally not obligated to work with you. Okay? No protection. And again, there's the compensation amounts that you can put in there, a combination of amounts. And then if you wish to work with the broker to purchase, the broker may ask you to sign a separate agreement detailing the parties' responsibilities during the sale. So there's a provision in there to sort of prime the pump for an exclusive buyer broker agreement. So it does disclose that the broker's compensation from any source will not exceed the amount of compensation in a written agreement with you. So again, don't shoot the messenger. That is what is in the agreement and what we're allowed to do. All right. So What does the Florida Realtor showing agreement look like? Remember, this is the dating one. This is not a fly-by-night lunch where you don't hear from the buyer again. This is now you're in a legal agency relationship and you owe duties to one another. So the showing agreement is between the consumer. This is the buyer. Florida Realtors are calling them consumers. So this is the buyer. Again, include the name that the buyer will take title on. It includes a term. It can be as short as 1 day. If you just met this person at your open house and they want you to go around and drive them around and show properties later, you can say, hey, let's sign this for 1 full day and see how it goes. You can have this to be, longer, and it extends if you go under contract during the term. Let's say you sign it for 1 day and then maybe 2 days later they want to go under contract. Well, you might want to just modify this to extend the term so that your days match, okay? The broker would be your first name and last name on your license and Premiere Plus Realty and the property. So remember, this one is property specific. It has a specific purpose. It has a specific property, and you can add multiple properties on there. So this agreement applies to the following properties. It is best practice to add every address, but legal language wise, you could put a zip code or you could put a particular neighborhood, but it needs to be extremely specific where we don't need to interpret it at all. We get it. We don't have to call you to ask. We understand the written, as it is written, what the property you are referring to is. All right. So this agreement outlines the broker's obligations. And one of those things is it's like an open relationship, right? The broker may work with other prospective consumers who want to acquire the same property, okay? And also the consumer's obligations. They must immediately contact the broker upon deciding to negotiate. They must inform other real estate licensees with whom the consumer has contact. So it's a loyalty agreement. It's saying, I will be loyal to you. The broker, though, doesn't have to be loyal to the consumer because they might be working with other buyers. Now, the compensation section of the showing agreement. Let's highlight here that the compensation amount may be satisfied or offset by the seller or listing agent. So the first highlighted section is compensation received by broker, if any, from an owner or an owner's broker for services rendered to the buyer will reduce any amount owed by consumer per this paragraph. So what does that mean in mechanical, practical terms? So what that means is you're saying in this agreement, in this showing agreement, hey, seller, if let's say, for example, we put 3% of the gross purchase price, but the seller is offering 2.5%. Basically, we're saying that that's going to reduce the amount owed by the buyer. The buyer will owe you 0.5%. And there are all kinds of ways that you can work that into the deal. That's what we talk about in our other classes, the way that 0.5% can be handled. But that's basically what this says is the idea. Let's use the word offset. Offset. Buyer, we're going to make every effort to offset your expense with this agreement. So we will offset it with the owner or the owner's broker. Again, for the purchase or exchange, there's a flat fee, percentage of the gross sales amount, or a combo of both. And there is a provision for a retainer. So you should know that we did the math, and it does take the same amount of hands and the same amount of time to process the paperwork in accounting and our transaction compliance team to process an additional check. So if you're going to do a retainer, just make it count because we will charge $100 to process that for you, so you can get your money directly. So if I would make that count if I were you, because $100 is wouldn't be worth it to do a small amount. Okay. I hope that makes sense. We have a lot of paperwork coming our way, and we want you to get paid quickly, so we need to pay people to make that happen. So I hope that makes sense business-wise. All right, so what does this look like for dispute resolution and acknowledgements? For the showing agreement, the dispute resolution happens between normal mediation and arbitration, not through the board. And the required disclosures include the provision that the broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to with the consumer, just so they're all clear. All right, that is the showing agreement. That's the dating one. We've gone through the lunch one. We've gone through the dating one. Now, here's the updated exclusive buyer broker agreement, transaction broker. You will note I am not even going to touch the single agent one because I've done a poll, and no offense to all of you wonderful agents, but if you can't tell me exactly what the transaction broker duties are and how it differs from single agent duties, you shouldn't be messing with single agency. You could commit a felony in the state of Florida by mishandling the single agent relationship. So as a brokerage, I am begging you to please just get the transaction broker version signed. Capiche? Okay. So exclusive, this is the Florida Realtor version. Alrighty, we're going to go through this version and then the NABOR version. This is the marital contract that you have with your buyer. This is, you are enmeshed, that you are representing that buyer, and you can have a lot of properties, big area, big commitment with them. So parties, again, consumer, this is the name of the purchaser. Best practice is to put it in the name they're taking title. The broker is the buyer's agent's first name, last name that's on their license, and Premiere Plus Realty. You'll notice that the broker has the exclusive right to work with the buyer to acquire a suitable property. A suitable property. So how do you define a suitable property? Well, you can do that in other terms, and we'll get to that in the next two sections. So what are the terms of this exclusive buyer broker agreement? There's a commencement date and there is a termination date. So it also extends through the life if you go under contract during that term. So with these new agreements, just like you do with your listing contracts and your sales contracts, get really good at calendaring those key dates. And in your transaction management software here in Workspace, you can calendar those dates and have it appear on your calendar if you syndicate your calendar. I mean, let's get really good at making sure we understand that we don't miss a date. Let's see here. So property. So the property description has been really reduced to be very, very general. So the type of property I recommend, if you are just looking at general residential property, the buyer's not sure if they want a condo or if they want a single family home or a duplex or townhome or whatever, you could just put residential property. And location, you could put something very broad like Florida, but it's better to be very specific. The truth of the matter is, if this is someone from out of town who cannot decide if they like the East Coast or the West Coast or the North or the South, but they really want to live in Florida, you don't want to entangle them in a broad buyer broker agreement. Let's make it a little more location specific because you are not an expert in all of those areas. Okay. Broker's obligation. We are saying that we will cooperate with a competing broker or another broker. So basically, we will call, we'll answer the phone, we'll work with, we will allow other brokers to enter. That would be our cooperation obligation. But there's no obligation of cooperating compensation. That's the big difference. We are cooperating, but we're not obligating to cooperate in compensation. So we also say here that this is a marriage buyer. You've got to be exclusive to me, but I can work with other buyers on that same property. However, I have a duty to you, buyer, to disclose any known offers. I can't give you the material facts of the offer, but I can let you know that one of the other buyers I'm working with on this same property has put an offer in. So It's that limited confidentiality, limited loyalty of a transaction broker. So that's what that does. I encourage you just to read that really clearly, because that's going to guide you and direct you on what to do if you're working with multiple buyers on the same property. All right. Consumer's obligation. This is what they, in our marriage relationship with the buyer, are asking them to do. So they will conduct all negotiations and efforts to locate only through the broker, and referring all inquiries to the broker on any property that they're interested in. If the consumer contacts or is contacted by an owner or real estate licensee, then they will say, hey, I'm working with an agent. I'm working with an agent. And they have to disclose the fact that they're in a written agreement with a real estate agent. So they are required to disclose. It helps you. I would highlight and circle this and say, make it very, very clear what you want them to do, especially when they go into a new construction property. Okay, this does have a retainer section. Again, we will be charging a fee for retainer, so make it count. It's a non-refundable retainer. It is not contingent upon specific performance of certain duties in the contract. So you don't have to list out 10 things you'll do for the buyer in order to receive a retainer. I wouldn't do that, because what if you only did 9 of those things? What are we going to owe them, 10%? Well, it's non-refundable, but now they're mad. So just keep it as is. A retainer, best case scenario for using a retainer option is you have people who are just not serious. It's taken, this person. They don't know what they want. They don't know where they want to live. They don't have their financing in order. They aren't sure. They're buying a car. They've got all things, it's just not, they're not doing what they need to do to be serious about buying a house, but they want you to show them every property for sale on God's green earth in Southwest Florida. So you could say, it doesn't sound like your timeline is reasonable right now. I'm happy to show you properties and spend my gas money and my time. And for that, I will need a retainer for that upfront cost, because I don't have a sense that you are going to purchase a property in a reasonable timeline. So you could have like a $3,000 retainer or something like that to cover the 2 years it will take them to finally decide. And if they end up renting after 2 years, then at least you got a little bit of something for your time and effort. So you could do this and get a percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee for anything they do buy. I hope that makes sense. That would be my best case use case for that situation. All right, so the compensation area of this is pretty straightforward. So it can be a flat fee or a percentage or a combination of both. You want to put the PPR 245 customer processing fee and additional fees. I know it's in our disclosures, our PPR disclosures, but I think it's helpful to add in here as well. All right. Let's see. So what's interesting is it's the compensation is owed if the consumer or any person acting on or behalf of consumer. So, if they have like a designated signee or someone who's a guardian, then that would be owed. So it kind of covers you there. What is helpful to note to your buyer in this is that, listen, this is the total amount that covers my fee for my services. And we will make every effort to have that fee reduced or offset by the seller or the listing broker. So in the last sentence of this paragraph 7 says compensation received by broker, if any, from an owner or an owner's broker for services rendered to consumer will reduce the amount owed by consumer per this paragraph. So That's the idea, is you have an agreement with your buyer, and then we go out and we hustle and we work really hard so that we can get that amount whittled down so it doesn't have to come out of the buyer's pocket. There's a protection period. So this is pretty standard from the last agreement. 30 days after termination, if the consumer goes around you and purchases that property, well, guess what? It's payday. So they can't do that. And you have a protection period. You could make this a longer protection period if the buyer agrees. So conditional termination. So there could be certain situations where the consumer and or the broker together make a decision to terminate this request. There's a provision in there to grab some sort of flat fee amount. Again, if you didn't do a retainer, but maybe you put a flat fee in here and it's a cancellation fee that just covers your gas money, then you could put an amount in there. And dispute resolution, again, this is handled through mediation and arbitration. Again, we have the disclosures that are required. Commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable, and the broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to with the consumer. All right, that is the Florida Realtor exclusive buyer broker agreement. This is the modification to that agreement and to the showing agreement. So there's two purposes with this one modification. So let's take a look at the NABOR buyer broker agreement. What does it look like to get married to a NABOR buyer broker agreement as a buyer? All right, so the buyer needs to be the name that's in which they're going to take title. That's the best practice. The broker needs their first name, last name that's on your license, and Premiere Plus Realty. And it outlines the duties owed to the buyer. I think you should read that so that you know what you're supposed to do. What we're going to do is go over the brokerage relationship and then just the other terms here in terms of compensation. Sorry, I think that. Okay, I wanted to point out here in this entry, the broker's role. It has a similar provision than as the Florida Realtor role. If you look at the last sentence, it says, buyer understands that other potential buyers may consider or make offers on or purchase through the broker the same or similar properties as buyer is seeking to acquire. It doesn't have all the language about, giving counter offers and letting you know, but the broker, I mean, Premiere Plus Realty, we could have a lot of buyers looking at the same property, or even that particular agent could. So brokerage relationship. So we are in Florida, a default transaction broker. Same story, different form. If you can't rattle off to me what the difference is between a single agent and a transaction broker and a no broker is, what you're supposed to do in those relationships, don't risk it. Just go transaction broker. Otherwise, you'd be committing a felony in the state of Florida if you handle single agency incorrectly. If you really want to know and you really want to do it, then talk to your broker. But let's just not even go there. So let's just select transaction broker and be done with it. All right. So buyer broker agreement. The buyer is agreeing to work exclusively with the buyer to refer to broker all inquiries about the any potential properties, notify other brokers or third parties of the existence of this agreement and the broker's exclusive relationship. The term of the agreement, buyer engages and grants the broker the exclusive right and authority to negotiate the purchase. They're not calling a bunch of other buyers, agents to do work on their behalf. And there's a commencement date and a termination date. So the commencement date, the default for that is the date this agreement is signed by the buyer. So that's the default commencement date. If you don't have a particular date in there, then it's the date it's signed by the buyer. The termination date, if none is entered, then is 180 calendar days from the commencement date. There's also a protection period. So if during the default is 90 days, if during the 90-day period, the a buyer enters into a contract to purchase the property, guess what? You will get paid your compensation. That's the idea. It is, you gotta pay the piper. Okay, so let's look at the compensation area. So there are the disclosures that are necessary. And you can put a percentage of the purchase price and a flat fee or a combination of both. I would add the $245 customer processing fee in there. Okay, so the NABOR buyer broker agreement. This is where I think if your buyer reads it carefully, and they should, I think they're gonna feel a little funny about signing it, but go for it and see what happens. And now you know all of your options for getting those written agreements taken care of. But for example, irrespective of whether the broker actually showed or located or introduced or wrote any offer, they get paid, right? So if the broker just didn't even do what their broker role was in the first part of the contract, then they still should get paid. Upon the event of buyer's default under any contract to purchase this property, the buyer shall be responsible for the compensation. So let's say the buyer defaults on the purchase agreement, they still owe the compensation to the buyer agent. Broker is authorized to negotiate for seller or listing broker to pay all or a portion of the compensation. So the buyer and the broker acknowledge that the seller may offer a credit to a buyer at closing towards buyer's closing cost and prepaids or seller concession. So it acknowledges that this is how the money could be provided to satisfy the terms of this agreement through a listing broker, through the seller, or through a seller concession to go toward closing costs. Different things. Same purpose in some ways, but different things. The seller concession can be used for a number of closing costs. Buyer agrees that if a seller concession is provided and seller and listing broker is either not offering compensation to the broker or the compensation is offered, that the broker is less than the compensation due to this agreement, then seller's concession will be used towards the payment of the broker's comp under this agreement. So it's like, hey, if what the seller or the listing broker is lower than what we've agreed to and the seller's offering a concession, well, that amount will kick in to cover the rest of what you owe me. So sorry, you're not going to have as much towards your repairs or your closing costs because we've got to make up the difference here in this agreement. And then again, brokers shall not receive compensation for broker services. That's more than this agreement. We've talked about that. And the scope of this, I'd like to just pause for a moment, just like we did with the Florida Realtor exclusive buyer broker agreement, and say that the scope of this agreement really means the property location. And the default is Collier Lee and Charlotte. But you have an ethical duty to not work outside of your area of expertise. There is no possible way that you can be an expert on all residential properties in all of Southwest Florida and know how to price appropriately or know that your buyer is getting the best price and intimately know every neighborhood. We need to be narrow, not wide. So I urge you to narrow the scope so that you can provide the most ethical service possible to your buyer and not lock them up in an agreement where they feel trapped. Because maybe they decided Charlotte County is where they want to live. And you're like, I ain't driving to Charlotte County. I don't know anything about Charlotte County. So let's just be professional and clear on where we serve. So for the default, all right. If the buyer fails to timely pay compensation upon closing, buyer hereby grants the broker the right to place a lien on the property. And it goes on and gets worse. So the lien can be foreclosed in the same manner as a mortgage, So it is serious consequences. If that buyer wants to get out of this obligation to pay your compensation, it's not mere mediation and arbitration. It is we're going to put a lien on your property. And of course, there are a number of steps that will be taken prior to this extreme measure, but it is something that your buyer might ask about. All right. That is the Florida Realtor exclusive buyer broker agreement, the NABOR exclusive buyer broker agreement. So you've looked at all of the buy side agreements, the compensation agreements, and the buyer agreements. So what I'd like to show you now is the NABOR listing of residential improved property exclusive right and authority to sell contract. But we'll only go through the compensation and concession areas because go to, you know, the NABOR listing agreement changed in many ways. But for the sake of time, let's take a look at just the areas that will impact you the most in terms of signing a new listing agreement and discussing the compensation with your seller. All right, so let's take a look at the NABOR listing agreement, section F, paragraph F, line 51 through 54. So the broker, this is the broker's obligations, is to give the listing agent permission to compensate buyer broker. So what it does is the seller is giving permission to the listing agent to share a portion of compensation to the buyer broker. So that is clearly outlined here. If they want to, if that area is filled out. So the compensation area, paragraph K, it's very long, so we'll just break it up into small pieces. But line 123 through 130 talks about, or rather 128 to 130, it indicates a total compensation to listing broker. So this is where you would put your full amount that goes to the listing agent. So it can be a percentage of the sales price or a big flat fee or a combination of all of those. Seller shall pay, number one, seller shall pay a total compensation to the broker if a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property is procured. So this is section 1 of paragraph K, broker compensation. Seller shall pay. Up at the top, line 31, you'll see section 2 of paragraph K. Broker has explained to seller. Now, it's not seller agrees, it's that you are putting your name on this document saying that you explain to the seller. This is one of our major terms of the settlement. That A, if the seller offers to compensate a buyer's broker who has procured the buyer broker compensation, such buyer broker compensation will be deducted from the compensation, with the broker retaining the balance of the compensation to be paid by seller as set forth herein. Okay. Legal language. We're going to take that full amount and we're going to whittle it down depending on what it is that you want to offer the buyer broker. You've explained to your seller that buyer agents and brokers, even if compensated by the listing broker or the seller, may represent the interests of a buyer. So what that says is, okay, well, we're in a transaction broker relationship. If a buyer brings if a buyer's agent brings a buyer to purchase this property, even though the seller is covering the buyer agent compensation, they're still going to be acting in the best interest of their buyer. The listing agent will have explained to the seller that C, that a buyer broker compensation is not set by law, fully negotiable, and that seller is not required to make an offer of compensation to a buyer broker or other buyer representative. So they might say, well, why would I? Why would I offer compensation to the buyer broker? What's the point if I don't have to? You mean I'm going to save some money here? Well, that's where you need to go to conversations about compensation or the script workshop where we talk about an objection to this paragraph here. So let's look at D. Seller elects the following. select one. You must select one. If no selection is made, then 2 shall apply. Number 1, the seller does elect to permit the listing agent to offer to share a portion of the compensation with a buyer broker who has procured the buyer. Upon receipt by broker of the compensation provided above. So whenever the listing agent receives the full amount, when Premiere Plus Realty receives the full check amount, then Premiere Plus Realty will pay the buyer broker this amount. And this is where you put the buyer agent compensation, percentage or a flat fee. We've got total up at the top, and then whatever portion of that you're sharing in section D. But remember, if you don't put anything or you don't select anything, then the default is 2 here, that the seller does not elect to permit the broker to offer a portion of comp. Okay, we might see this more and more come about, where you as the listing agent, you are not allowed to share a portion of your commission with a buyer agent because the seller just doesn't want to do that, and as is their right. But what they can do, and what we'll talk about here in a moment, is you could prep the seller and say, well, we might not indicate a offer of compensation here, but you should know that buyers may request in their purchase offer that you cover the buyer agent compensation per their written agreement with their buyer agent. So seller, they might ask for it anyway. So we could just, if you want to not offer it, you should just prepare that offers may come in where it is requesting that amount anyway. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so section E, this is where you can put that variable amount, or no, I'm sorry, not the variable amount, but who you want to offer that amount to. Transaction brokers, single agents, or no brokerage relationship. All right, jumping to section L, line 158 of the listing agreement. It's where it talks about seller's concession. So seller does not or does. So you could do both. You could do a compensation for the listing agent, you could do compensation for the buyer agent, and you could do a seller concession. We're in a buyer's market. We're going to see a lot of listing agreements that are offering all 3. Most listing agreements or most deals happen with some seller concession as it is. So seller does not or does elect to offer concession to buyer in the amount of flat fee or percentage of the purchase price towards a buyer's closing cost and prepaids. It's called seller concession. Which amount, so that seller concession amount may be used towards the payment of compensation to a buyer broker. So you need to select one. If no selection is made, then does not offer concessions shall apply. And I added section M in there just to note that the sellers need to provide the association information. It's been a problem. It's in the listing agreement now. The seller needs to understand that they need to provide those documents. So there you go. So what does this look like for the seller? What is the seller agreeing to in the NABOR listing contract? Well, they agree to provide a verification of compensation. Which agreement would that be? That could be the brokerage compensation agreement. That could be the seller to buyer broker compensation agreement. And if elected under the comp paragraph in paragraph K, verification of any buyer broker compensation. So they are agreeing to those forms that we just showed you, the buyer broker compensation and so forth. And they are agreeing to pay the broker compensation if one is indicated.